Good morning. This hearing will come to order. Welcome, everyone. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on the impact of rising tensions between the United States and Iran and on U.S. policy and interests in the Middle East and on regional stability. May I ask for unanimous consent for Representative Perry, who's a full member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, to join us this morning? Without objection. I want to note that Chairman Deutsch will be joining us late this morning. I thank our witnesses for appearing today. I now recognize myself for the purpose of making an opening statement. There are a number of significant questions before us. First, are the American people more safe or less safe after the killing of Qasem Soleimani? How are the Trump administration's escalation and program of maximum pressure impacting U.S. interests and stability in the region? What are the explicit benchmarks and goals of the Trump administration's policies toward Iran and Iraq? As a member of the subcommittee, I have significant concerns about the administration's inability to answer these questions and communicate a coherent strategy to confront the Iranian challenge while avoiding war and keeping us safe. I have to say that we had hoped to hear from Secretary Pompeo about this in the Foreign Affairs Committee 2 weeks ago, but he refused to testify. The committee has invited him again to a hearing tomorrow, and I sincerely hope he attends, because our questions about U.S. actions against Iran get at some of the most fundamental issues of war and peace that come before Congress. We're exercising our constitutional duty, and I would imagine that as a former member of Congress, the Secretary understands that. Soleimani was responsible for the attacks that killed hundreds of Americans and thousands of Iraqis, Syrians, and others. The careful plotting and planning he put into sowing death, destruction, and chaos is absolutely reprehensible. There's no doubt that under his command, the Quds forces' efforts to expand terror pose a direct threat to U.S. interests and American lives. However, the Trump administration has failed to provide a coherent rationale for the strike that killed him, and it remains an open question whether eliminating one threat is worth the consequences of this action. The fact remains the American people have seen no evidence that killing Soleimani prevented an imminent attack against American facilities or personnel, and no evidence of a discernible political plan for our policy toward Iran moving forward. I don't want to ignore the implications for Iraq either. Before the situation escalated so dramatically at the end of December, Iraqis were taken to the streets to protest pervasive Iranian influence in their country. These protesters forced Iraq's leaders to take action, resulting in new electoral law and the resignation of Prime Minister Abdul Mahdi. The Iraqi protest struck me as a very real and passionate expression of a people who want to be free of undue Iranian influence. Instead, Iraq now seems to be the site of a proxy battle. The administration's escalation has jeopardized our interest in Iraq. Now that U.S. military personnel are focused almost entirely on force protection against threats posed by Iran and its militia partners, almost all of our counter-ISIS efforts in Iraq are paused. Iran would like nothing more than to force American civilian and military personnel out of Iraq. Following the strike on Soleimani, the Iraqi Council of Representatives voted to end U.S. military presence there. Last Friday, tens of thousands have protested in the streets of Baghdad, calling for the expulsion of American troops. And the largest protest movement appears to be splintering. I cannot stress this enough. This is exactly what Iran has wanted all along. It serves no one's best interest if our actions lead to a dramatic reduction in regional diplomacy, a resurgence of ISIS, and free rein for Iran and its proxies. Finally, I'd like to make the point, because I think this administration needs to be reminded, Congress has not authorized war with Iran. What we need now is a clear strategy. We should use this occasion to develop one that is based on collaboration between equal branches of our government and enjoys bipartisan support. In the long run, this is more likely to make us safe and strong than the escalatory action that seemed to have taken over the last month. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses and thank them for helping us understand the consequences of recent events in U.S.-Iran relations, their implications for the Middle East, and how the United States can best navigate this difficult path forward. I now recognize the ranking member for the purpose of making an opening statement.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to be here today, and thank you, Chairman David Trone, for standing in for Chairman Deutsch. Thank you for calling this important hearing to examine what comes next for U.S. policies and interests in the Middle East after President Donald Trump's courageous, game-changing decision to protect Americans by eliminating Qasem Soleimani, a merciless terrorist who was directly responsible for the deaths of at least 700 Americans in the conflict that we have in the global war on terrorism. Iran has been threatening the United States since taking the American diplomats hostage during the Islamic Revolution in 1979. This is not a secret. The regime chants, death to America, death to Israel. These chants are not empty words. These are the followers of the Ayatollah announcing their intentions to the world, and it's our responsibilities as protectors of the American people to recognize that and respond as needed to defend American families. I firmly believe that the attacks of Iran and its proxies have engaged in the past year, and as recently with the missile attack yesterday, beginning with the bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut, and on to ballistic missile attacks of U.S. forces in Iraq, attacks against the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, shooting down an American drone and attacking oil tankers in oil fields, an attempted assassination in Washington. All are hallmarks of the rogue Iranian regime's murderous conduct. These attacks will not stop if they're left unaddressed. President Trump's strike on Soleimani was a needed step to achieve peace through strength. Today we will discuss what other steps are needed to bring stability to the Middle East, even as Iran works to sow discord and chaos. We must continue the maximum pressure campaign. The sanctions against the Iranian rulers are working. The despots in Iran are desperate. Now is not the time to restore resources for tyrants to continue aggression in the region. Sanctions relief did not lead the authoritarians to moderate behavior before, and it will not have that effect now. Turning to Iraq, the United States must make it a priority to stand for human rights, accountability, and meaningful government reform. For months, the Iraqi people have been expressing their democratic rights as guaranteed to them by the Iraqi Constitution, protesting corruption in their government and Iran's interference in their country. Gruesomely, these protesters have been slaughtered. Amnesty International says that over 600 people have been killed. It's our responsibility to stand with these protesters and defend their rights. That's why my colleague, Representative Tom Malinowski, and I have introduced H.R. 5376, the Iraq Human Rights and Accountability Act of 2019, which requires a State Department review to determine if certain popular mobilization forces and Interior Ministry leaders meet the criteria for imposition of sanctions pursuant to the Global Magnitsky Act, Human Rights and Accountability Act. The Trump administration has courageously imposed sanctions on the PMF tyrants and made corruption designations. I know the administration will continue to take a strong stance on this issue, and I hope this committee will take up the Iraq Human Rights and Accountability Act. Similarly, we must remain steadfast in our support of the rights of the people of Iran, who have also engaged in peaceful protest against the Islamic Republic's tyrannical policies. Later today, the full House will vote on a resolution Mr. Joyce and I authored to support the right of the Iranian people to protest. In Lebanon, following months of popular protest of government corruption and inefficiency, a pro-Hezbollah government has taken over. This development is concerning for obvious reasons, and I look forward to hearing from our witnesses how the United States should tailor our policies in response. I thank the witnesses for their testimony. Look forward to their analysis and recommendations. Thank you again, Chairman Trone, and I yield back.
I will now recognize members of the subcommittee for 1 minute opening statements, should they wish to make one. Representative Conley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this hearing. I just want to say that I think we've heard a lot of red herrings and false intelligence justifying the assassination of a foreign leader. However malign an actor he was, and he was, is it going to be the policy of the United States to take out, by assassination, every malign leader in the Middle East? Of course not. Is it going to be the policy of the United States to take a unilateral action without consultation with Congress or our allies and worry about the consequences subsequently? Are we going to lie about the justification for such actions while we're at it? That cannot be the policy of the United States in this region. It is not the proper action of a great power, and frankly, it has weakened the United States, not strengthened us. And unlike what Secretary Pompeo says, today is not a safer world, it's a more dangerous world after that action. There should have been proper consultation, careful vetting, and a clear understanding of the import of this action. None of that happened. And all of that flows from the disastrous decision by this president to walk away from our own nuclear agreement with Iran that was working. Well, I know we'll explore that in the hearing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any other members? Mr. Perry?
Well, I sure thank the chairman and the ranking member for their indulgence in the UC of my time here. I reject categorically the assertion that there's no strategic or tactical plan regarding the elimination of Soleimani from the battlefield. The fact that the administration doesn't come out and tell members of Congress or the world at large what the strategic or tactical plan is it's appropriate that they don't. We don't tell our enemies what the plan is, and unfortunately, Congress and even some of in the president's own administration can't be trusted with that information, not to give it to the world or our enemies. This was not an assassination, and this individual was not a foreign leader. This individual was a terrorist wearing the uniform of a nation state that uses terrorism as statecraft. I heard nothing from my colleagues on the other side when their president eliminated almost 4,000 people from areas outside the battlefield, terrorists that should have been eliminated, and the world is a safer place because they were. And that's why we didn't hear anything from either side. And with that, I yield back.
And without objection, all members may have up to 5 days to submit statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. I will now introduce our witnesses. Dr. Mara Carlin is the Director of Strategic Studies at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. She's also an Associate Professor at SAIS and a non-resident Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. Dr. Carlin served in the national security roles for 5 U.S. Secretaries of Defense, advising on policies spanning strategic planning, defense budgeting, future wars, and the evolving security environment and regional affairs. Most recently, she served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development. Welcome back to the subcommittee. Dr. Ariane Tabatabi is an Associate Political Scientist at the RAND Corporation and an Adjunct Senior Research Scholar at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. She's also a Truman National Security Fellow and on the Council of Foreign Relations member. Previously, she served as a visiting assistant professor of security studies at Georgetown University, Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service, was international consultant for NATO, and held several positions for the Harvard Kennedy School, Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. We also welcome back Ms. Danielle Pletka, a Senior Fellow in Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Until January 2020, Ms. Pletka was the Senior Vice President of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at AEI. Ms. Pletka holds the Andrew H. Siegel professorship in American Middle East Foreign Policy at Georgetown University Walsh School of Foreign Service. Previously, Ms. Pletka was a senior professional staff member for Middle East and South Asia, Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. Thank you all for being here today. Let's remind witnesses to please limit your testimony to 5 minutes, and without objection, your prepared written statements will be made a part of the hearing record. Thank you for being here today. Dr. Carlin, you may begin.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to appear before you today. This morning, I will be summarizing my written remarks, which I submit for the record. As U.S.-Iran dynamics grow sportier in the wake of Qasem Soleimani's killing, there are 3 insights I would like to convey. First, U.S. strategy vis-a-vis Iran is convoluted and clunky. This administration has outlined its vision of a fundamentally different Iranian regime through its maximum pressure campaign. Yet it has attempted this policy while simultaneously pursuing contradictory efforts. It has a national security strategy and national defense strategy focused on great power competition. It pulled out of the nuclear agreement without any effort to lay the groundwork for a new deal. It promulgated vague and contradictory and ad hoc responses to Iranian aggression, from skipping tens of rungs on the escalation ladder by killing Soleimani, while confusingly lurching in the aborted response last summer when Iran shot down a U.S. drone. This confusing approach is read by the Iranians as feckless, by regional partners as fickle, and by other U.S. adversaries like North Korea as presenting opportunities for mischief. The latest escalation raises considerations like how and in what ways Congress should financially support adventurism absent strategy, and how Congress can compel a coherent strategic approach to policymaking on the Middle East. For those who question whether missile salvos by the Iranian military constituted the sum total of Iran's retaliation for the Soleimani killing, let me be clear. Though the timing and the target of future action are uncertain, there should be no doubt that further Iranian response is sure to follow. That response could look like attacks by Iranian clients such as Hezbollah against soft targets frequented by U.S. military personnel or directly against U.S. diplomats or civilians. Simply put, we have reached the end of the beginning of this escalatory cycle. My second insight, the Middle East is moving along a trajectory that increasingly favors Tehran. In Syria, Iran has managed, with support from Russia and Hezbollah, to keep Bashar al-Assad in power. In Lebanon, the new government further empowers Hezbollah and Damascus. In Iraq, key constituencies are seriously reconsidering the U.S. military presence. In Yemen, the Saudis and the Emiratis spent years battling the Houthis, with little to show for it besides horrific Yemeni losses and Iranian delight. Across the region, Iran's clients are not only growing in capacity, but also in capability. Furthermore, the Russians, not the Americans, have committed to consistent diplomatic offensives across the region. Not only do the Russians have a seat at the table in the Middle East, they increasingly are setting the table as well. There are steps the United States can take to adjust this trajectory. Hezbollah and Iran would be overjoyed if the United States gave up on Lebanon. It is essential to watch as the military and the government sniff around for a new rapprochement, to ensure the military continues to tackle threats of mutual concern, and to increase force protection for Americans in Lebanon. The United States should excoriate Lebanese leaders who further undermine Lebanese sovereignty. In the Gulf, ratcheting down tensions is a shrewd move. Key Gulf states like the UAE and Saudi Arabia are seeking accommodation with the Iranians. We should also encourage an end to the Saudi spat with Qatar and urge the Saudis to find a path out of the Yemen war. And above all, we should find a way to normalize the U.S.-Saudi relationship rather than prioritize it. My third insight, the United States must find a way to meaningfully deprioritize the Middle East. The key geopolitical challenge going forward is posed by China, and yet we remain trapped in Middle East purgatory. The over-militarized approach to the region continues. At least 20,000 new U.S. military forces have been sent to the region in recent months, bringing the total estimate of U.S. military personnel to 80,000, which comes at a time as our diplomatic presence is plummeting. The administration's maximum pressure campaign is resulting in maximum focus on Iran, and there are opportunity costs for doing so. Going forward, I urge you to look at the following areas of concern. On strategy and execution, given that U.S. strategy toward Iran and the Middle East is convoluted, the administration should clarify what is it trying to achieve, why is it trying to do so, and above all, how it will do so. On the counter ISIS campaign and coalition, given that the conflagration between the United States and Iran has imperiled the fight against ISIS and fueled discontent among some Iraqis, the administration should explain how it plans to rehabilitate the fight, and Congress should deepen its consultation with key coalition members, especially the Iraqis. A deal in disarray, given that detonating U.S. participation in the nuclear agreement, rather than considering ways to improve it, has resulted in the United States dividing itself from its fellow signatories while Iran pursues its own agenda. Congress should help formulate pathways with partners to limit Iran's nuclear program. And our regional presence and purpose. Given that for 2 decades the United States has overwhelmingly relied on a military approach to the region, Congress should consider how the United States can right-size its military posture and grow a more robust diplomatic presence. As I outlined today, there are no simple solutions. However, some steps are overdue in leading Middle East strategy in a more coherent and sustainable direction. Thank you for your time. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Dr. Tabatatai?
Thank you, sir. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Wilson, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My testimony will proceed in 3 parts. First, I will begin by looking at the internal dynamics in Iran today before examining what we might expect from the regime next, and I will end by discussing U.S. policy options. Repression has been a consistent feature of the Islamic Republic since its inception in 1979, but 2019 marked new trends. It revealed the regime's heightened perception of threats both at home and abroad, a new boldness in operations, and a new capability, the ability to completely shut down the internet. So far, Tehran's actions in 2020 indicate the regime's willingness to continue to attempt to sideline not only those outside of the regime space, but also groups and individuals typically associated with the pragmatist segments of the system. The regime is currently primarily engaged in 2 types of efforts to limit dissent. 1, it is preventing and stopping popular opposition by hindering the flow of information and through the use of lethal force. And 2, it is limiting dissent within the ranks of the regime, which includes restricting certain factions' involvement in the political process, such as the ongoing efforts to disqualify candidates belonging to certain camps by taking part in the elections. Nevertheless, unrest continues in Iran as the maximum pressure campaign, coupled with the regime's own incompetence and corruption, continue to take their toll on Iran's economy. Despite continued popular unrest, the regime appears unlikely to fundamentally change its domestic or foreign policy behavior. And although Iran appears to have made a symbolic response to Soleimani's death, the regime probably does not feel that it has achieved full justice for Soleimani's killing. The United States should be prepared for further action from Iran, likely a more subtle response that is intended to limit our ability to react. Though limited, Iran's toolbox allows the regime to overcome its conventional inferiority vis-à-vis the United States, enabling it to pose a challenge to us and our partners. It includes the following: disinformation to sway public opinion, attempts to interfere in our elections, cyber attacks and efforts to target U.S. persons, organizations, agencies, and infrastructure, a network of proxies including tens of thousands of fighters across several theaters and countries, direct IRGC attacks on U.S. personnel, assets, and interests, resumption of attacks on oil infrastructure, and the resumption of nuclear activities that were previously halted under the JCPOA. Clearly, the United States should be prepared for all scenarios, including a potential collapse of the regime. However, for the foreseeable future, the United States should be crafting policies that advance U.S. interests, even if the Islamic Republic remains in place, because that is currently the most likely scenario. In the event of further escalation from Iran, the United States may very well have to consider a kinetic response, but it should do so when its own strategic gains are clear. Deploying more forces whose mission and operational status is unclear to the region might not actually deter Iran, and the deployment arguably offers more targets for asymmetric Iranian retaliation. Merely moving troops is not sufficient to deter an adversary when red lines and objectives are not clearly and credibly communicated. The United States can identify and discreetly target Iranian proxy capabilities as it has in the past. This could be effective if deployed surgically and accompanied by clear messaging to Tehran. Given recent developments, appetite for negotiations in Iran is likely limited. Nevertheless, the United States can prepare the groundwork for engagement by sending clear signals to Tehran that it is serious about seeking a diplomatic solution and avoiding conflict, as the President has done on a number of occasions. Currently, U.S. policy toward Iran is heavily reliant on sanctions. Sanctions are a critical means of achieving U.S. objectives. But they are only fully effective if they are coupled with other U.S. instruments of power. The administration should consider offering a cohesive message to Iran that clearly lays out U.S. objectives, what the United States is willing to offer to Iran, and what Iran would have to do in return. This would need to be done within the framework of a realistic plan that does not rely on maximalist positions. Absent this, Tehran may interpret the administration's ultimate goal as its complete surrender, and such capitulation is a non-starter for Iran and has historically led nations to go to war. Congress could request more clarity in this messaging and decision-making process, as well as encourage coordination with allies. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Pletka?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Wilson, good morning. Thank you so much for having me back. It's always an honor to testify before this committee. The title of this hearing, the title of this hearing, I believe, misplaces a bit what should be the appropriate focus on the Islamic Republic of Iran. Without overstating the case, I believe this is not actually a moment of escalation with Iran, at least not in terms of direct conflict. We're likely to see, as my colleagues have pointed out, some proxy escalation, but even that, I think, we'll be careful for fear of provoking the unpredictable President Trump. More important, I believe, is that notwithstanding victories in Syria, Iran really is in a period of flux and stress, unlike many we've seen in recent years. Internally, next door in Iraq and in Lebanon, home to Iran's most important proxy, Hezbollah, the regime is under enormous pressure. In conjunction with Qasem Soleimani's death and the likely transition ahead of the death of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei, those pressures create an opportunity for the United States. The key questions are, what are we going to do with that opportunity, what the actual policy of the United States is toward the Islamic Republic, and how the maximum pressure campaign will impact those aims. On the direct question of the impact of the Soleimani strike, let's start with Iran itself and the Quds Force that the late general led for the last 2 decades. Those who've suggested that the IRGC and the Quds Force will revert to business as usual after the passing of their leaders, I think are confused about the role that Soleimani played. He was not simply the leader of Iran's expeditionary forces and coordinator of its proxies. He was a man of great strategic intelligence and cunning, with charisma that made his leadership all the more effective. His successor, Ismail Qaani, is, to paraphrase an American politician, no Qasem Soleimani. What does that mean? That'll be guesswork for us, but Qaani's power to control Iran's major proxies may portend increased independent action on their part. We've already seen threats against U.S. officials and a call for personal jihad, which is highly unusual in the Shia faith, by Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah. The Hashd al-Shabi, the popular mobilization units in Iraq, have also escalated attacks on U.S. targets in Iraq. This is all happening at a moment of uncertainty in Iran itself, which recently suffered the worst demonstrations it's experienced since the revolution. Protests in Iran reemerged on a large scale last November, and hundreds, if not thousands, have died at the hands of security forces, and it took weeks to crush the protests. With elections ahead and Ayatollah Khamenei's succession due sooner rather than later, no wonder those deeply invested in the system of the Islamic Republic are worried. Things have been similarly unstable in neighboring Iraq, where popular demonstrations forced the resignation of Iraqi Prime Minister Abdel Mahdi. Those demonstrations have been ongoing also since the beginning of October. It's important to understand just how much of a slap in the face these demonstrations in Iraq are to Iran. They have been dominated by Iraqi Shiites. They've focused on governance failures, corruption, and on Iranian influence. And neither efforts by regular police nor the Hashd were capable of stifling that popular anger. The Iranian consulate in Najaf was attacked and burned down. Ironically, demonstrations began around the same time in Lebanon and have focused on exactly the same thing: governance failures, corruption, and sectarianism. Those also resulted in the collapse of the government, with Prime Minister Saad Hariri stepping down. A new Hezbollah-only government has since been appointed, with Hezbollah's chosen candidate, Hassan Diab, at its helm. Circling back to Tehran and looking at its major satellites in Iraq and Lebanon, it's fair to say Ayatollah Khamenei has had a bad month. Remember, he celebrated the beginning of 2020 thinking he had quelled protests at home, that the United States was weak, disengaged. 2019 saw the disastrous Trump decision to quit northeastern Syria and betray our Kurdish allies, as well as the administration's low-key responses to the downing of an American drone, attacks on Gulf shipping, and the direct attack on Saudi Arabia's Abqaiq and Khurais facilities. While the U.S. did in fact retaliate in all instances with substantial cyber attacks on Iran, according to my understanding, the failure to respond overtly only served to reinforce the signal that the Syria withdrawal had sent, that the U.S. is turning its back on the Middle East. But then the Soleimani strike and the U.S. dismissal of efforts to toss U.S. forces out of Iraq put paid to that notion that the U.S. was ceding the region. The question this hearing raises is, what's next? What is the message the United States is trying to send? That's a question not only on our minds here, but on the minds of policymakers and leaders in Jerusalem and in Riyadh and elsewhere in the Middle East who wonder what the U.S. strategic posture really is. Are we committed to staying in Iraq? Are we committed to Saudi Arabia's defense, to staying in Syria, to competing with the Russians, to keeping the plus of troops in the Gulf, or not? Is the maximum pressure campaign about a new JCPOA, or is it really about regime collapse? The right course is to amp up pressure on Iran politically, militarily, and diplomatically. I have just another moment, if you won't mind. And for the Congress, if I may, to embrace some consistency on the question of Iran policy. It's incoherent to denounce the Soleimani killing and the abandonment of the Kurds in much the same breath. Either we want a robust posture in the region, or we don't want a robust posture in the region. The right course is to begin to work more seriously with Iranian dissidents and opponents of the regime with a view to a better future, to further isolate Iran's supporters within Lebanon and Iraq, and empower protesters against Iranian domination. We know the regime is under pressure. We know they will seek to regain their footing. We know their economic resources are stretched. We know the Iraqi people and the Lebanese people do not actually wish to be ruled from Tehran. What we do not know is what U.S. policy actually will be going forward. That's a much-needed clarity. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your testimony. We'll now move to member questions under the 5-minute rule. I will begin, followed by Ranking Member Wilson. It will then alternate between the parties. Let me begin by asking Dr. Carlin. With respect to the Soleimani strike, there's concern that the Trump administration did not consider the fallout or implications for other U.S. interests in the region. Hezbollah, arguably Iran's strongest proxy, in addition to its ongoing military activities, how and where could Iran deploy Hezbollah to threaten U.S. or our partners? And what advanced capabilities has Iran provided Hezbollah that are most concerning to the U.S.?
Thank you for your question, Mr. Chairman. I think there is very real concern that is warranted that the administration did not think about the second and third order effects to this strike, a strike that had been pondered by previous U.S. administrations and also by the Israelis, and then not taken. Had there been some serious consideration, I think we would have seen enhanced force protection, for example, and a plethora of embassy notifications, particularly across the Middle East, and perhaps flowing troops ahead of time. So I think there's a lot of evidence that one should be concerned that these attendant effects were not considered. How the Iranians might respond, there's not a shortage of options, to be frank. They've done the official military response, right? And it ended up being relatively superficial, and luckily the injuries were not catastrophic, although very real on the U.S. military personnel side. What we should expect now is going to be some sort of effort by their various clients, quite possibly by Hezbollah. There are soft targets across the Gulf. For example, if you look at Bahrain, places where U.S. sailors hang out, you could see them hitting U.S. troops in places like Jordan, also no shortage of soft targets there, or even potentially going directly against U.S. diplomats around the region. So they have a lot of options, and I guess what I would say is stay tuned, right? When we've looked at the Iranians historically, they haven't necessarily felt this need to respond automatically, right? We've seen this when folks like Imam Mughni or Abbas Massawi were killed. So we now really need to be, I think, in an eyes wide open and as prepared as possible posture.
What do you see next in Syria on Hezbollah?
On Syria, I think the Iranians and Hezbollah and the Russians have gotten what they wanted. Bashar al-Assad is not going anywhere. Granted, he has this sporty insurgency to continue tackling, and it's, that will continue, but a year from now, 2 years from now, when we're having further hearings, I suspect Bashar al-Assad will still be around. And as he increasingly takes control, Hezbollah will be able to now focus less on Syria and more on other things that the Iranians need them to do, in particular what's happening domestically in Lebanon.
Thank you. Dr. Tabatabai, the downing of the Ukrainian airliner sparked the resurgence of demonstrations in Iran. How will these protests affect near-term Iranian decision-making, specifically potential retaliation for the killing of Soleimani? And how are the protests impacting the parliamentary elections scheduled in February in Iran?
Thank you, sir. Yes, as you mentioned, the downing of the airliner has led to protests in Iran. What is important to note, though, is that protests are an inherent feature of Iranian public life. They have been happening for 40 years. So I would be careful to kind of chase what is happening in Iran domestically and put too much weight in terms of what impact it may have on the regime. That said, it is quite clear now, I think, that the next parliament in Iran is going to be fairly hardline, that most of the so-called reformists and moderates have been sidelined in an attempt to undermine President Rouhani and his efforts going into the Iranian presidential election year.
Ms. Pletka, Iran has long sought the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Iraq. In what ways is Tehran likely to exert pressure on the Iraqi political system to push for the expulsion of our troops? How should we respond? And do you believe the reduced diplomatic presence in Iraq is hindering our ability to counter Iranian influence in Baghdad?
Thank you, sir. That's a great question. I think that's going to be Iran's #1 priority, is to use its proxies, whether they are in terrorist groups around the region or in governments that they support, to try to push U.S. troops out of the region and to try to extend Iranian influence even further than it has extended in recent years. They are going to do that using the popular mobilization units. They're going to do that using the turmoil that we see on the ground right now in the formation of a new government. They're going to do that using Hezbollah. They're going to use that using strategic attacks against U.S. targets that they believe go up to but do not push past what they believe or assess to be the president's red line. The challenge for them, of course, is not knowing exactly where that is and going too far, because going too far will clearly provoke a response, as the president has proven earlier this year. I'm sorry, what was the second part of your question? Oh, the diplomatic part. Look, are we going to be harmed by that? Absolutely. We have been harmed over the last 3.5 years by our failure to have people in positions of authority at mid-levels in government and in senior positions in our embassies. We need people in Baghdad. We need people in Beirut. We need people. We didn't have an ambassador in Saudi Arabia for the first 2 years of this administration. I believe that that harms not only our ability to conduct diplomacy, but our ability to manage the challenge that Iran presents to us. Some of those challenges have been remediated. We have an ambassador now in both places. And we have an assistant secretary for Near East Affairs. At the same time, there's no question that what you want is not a militarized answer to every challenge. What you want is militarized diplomacy backed up by that military.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson?
Thank you, Chairman Trone, and thank each of you for being here today. Ms. Pletka, how would you assess the effectiveness of the United States sanctions on Iran, which have been courageously placed by President Donald Trump? Have you detected any changes in Iran's behavior since the maximum pressure campaign has begun? And how best can we help the people of Iran, who are the heirs of the extraordinary Persian culture?
Thank you for asking that question. On the issue of sanctions, I think many of us who believed that an effort to reconstitute sanctions after the JCPOA would be very difficult, if not impossible, have been, the word I like to use is gobsmacked, by how effective they have been. The president and his team have done, I think, by all accounts, an impressive job in putting together the most serious, the most biting campaign of sanctions that have been in place. Iran's foreign currency assets are diminished extraordinarily. Iran's currency has dropped precipitously. Iran's oil exports are below a quarter of a million barrels per day, which is their main source of income. The only question there is, again, to what end? And you rightly follow up with the question of how we can best help the people of Iran, because these sanctions, while they impact the people of Iran, are, of course, focused on the regime of the Islamic Republic, not on the people of Iran. They are the victims of this regime, and they will suffer alongside. How can we best help them? You know, we have never been terribly successful at answering that question, not since the end of the Cold War. And I believe that if this committee, were to turn to that question, it would be hugely helpful to our policy. Because no matter what, even if these demonstrations that we're seeing in Iran are unlikely to lead to regime collapse, and I believe they are unlikely to lead to that, at the same time, we should know what it is that we hope will be there instead of the ayatollahs and the mullahs that are running the country right now.
Thank you very much. It's also encouraging to see our EU allies now adjusting to hopefully embracing sanctions. And Ms. Pletka, how should the U.S. alter its Lebanon policy in response to the new pro-Hezbollah government? How does this change in our strategic posture toward Lebanon?
Lebanon is really a modern-day tragedy, and our failure to do more to limit Hezbollah's influence in Lebanon over successive administrations, nonpartisan criticism or bipartisan criticism is in place. Right now, what we're looking at is the replacement of a government that was a fig leaf for Hezbollah to a government that is plain Hezbollah. The implications for Israel, the implications for us, the implications for terrorism, and the implications for the Lebanese people are very serious. What we need to do, again, is we need to work to isolate those inside Lebanon who have robbed the country blind with their corruption, who support terrorism, and who seek to drag Lebanon as a victim into war with Israel at some point in the future. How we do that is partly the way we have so far, through sanctions, but sanctions are a very blunt tool. We also need to empower and help the people who are willing to stand up to Hezbollah. And there, I feel we have really fallen down on the job. We have supported only the Lebanese military, and believing that the Lebanese military is a key tool in fighting Sunni extremism. Well, it is, but it's also a key tool in helping Hezbollah. We need a much more refined, much more directed policy that looks to empower good guys and to isolate and harm bad guys.
Thank you. And Dr. Tabatabai, what more can we do to support the popular protesters in Iraq?
So I think that, U.S. role in supporting protesters should actually be fairly limited because even though it's useful to help the flow of information, it is helpful to make statements encouraging and standing with people across the region. Ultimately, the decision for who should govern those countries is theirs, and we should be fairly limited in how many statements we make in that direction.
And thank you. As we conclude, again, I'm just so proud of the President's courage to go and eliminate Soleimani. He killed directly hundreds of Americans. With the IEDs, thousands of Americans today have lost arms and legs. And so I appreciate so much the leadership of President Trump, peace through strength. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Malinowski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm actually not going to talk about the main issue of Soleimani today. I just want to focus on one thing that we all say we agree on. We all like to think we agree on, and that is our support for the people of Iran who are struggling against this dictatorship, struggling for freedom, the people of Iran who are saying that they want to be part of the world, particularly the younger people, the people of Iran who show their sentiments by refusing to walk over an American flag because they realize that that's just dumb propaganda from their regime, and again, they want to be part of the world and they want to be connected to us. So we all say that we stand by them, and we congratulate ourselves for saying this, and we feel good about saying this. But here's what we are actually doing. The people of Iran, anyone who is born in Iran, is presumptively denied entry into the United States right now under a travel ban that makes 0 sense from a national security point of view. Unless they get a waiver, they can't come here. On top of that, in the last several weeks, we have had incident after incident after incident of Iranians, particularly students, coming to the United States with visas, which means that they have been vetted thoroughly by the State Department, by DHS, passed every test. They arrive at an airport, and some Border Patrol officer looks at them for 20 minutes and sends them back without any consultation with other parts of the U.S. government, destroys their lives because many of them have spent thousands of dollars making the journey to come to the United States. Some of them have been to the United States, studied here, and have just left for a conference and are told, often degraded, often humiliated at airports, we don't want you here because you are Iranian. Today, we are going to be passing a resolution in the House that says we stand by the people of Iran in their struggle for human rights. I'm going to vote for that resolution because I agree with every word in it. It's sponsored by my friend, the chairman of this subcommittee. But I also think this resolution is in some ways shameful. We are going to be pretending today to stand by the people of Iran, even as this House, even as this Congress, does not a damn thing about what the U.S. government is actually doing. Our actual policy right now is to hurt the people of Iran. And that's what we need to be speaking about. So I want to ask everybody here, our witnesses, whether you agree or disagree with what I just said. Is our current approach consistent with the lessons that we learned during the Cold War, for example, when we took on the Soviet Union, when we took on their leaders, their regimes, while welcoming the freedom-loving people who lived behind the Iron Curtain, who wanted to come to the United States, study here, learn from us? Are we doing the right thing, and are we really standing by the people of Iran as we conduct this policy? Whoever wants to start, but I'd like to hear from all three of you.
Thank you, Congressman Malinowski. I'm in violent agreement with you and everything you just highlighted. If this were our priority, we would be emphasizing every day how corrupt the regime is. We would be facilitating internal communication. We would be bringing Iranians here. We would be finding ways to engage the Iranian people, and we would have clarity on our messaging. I think what you've heard from all three of us witnesses is that we're really confused about what the U.S. is trying to do. And if we're confused, that's particularly problematic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sir, yeah, thank you. I'm also completely in agreement with you and my colleague. In addition to the travel ban and, of course, all the issues you highlighted at the border, there's also the humanitarian impact of sanctions that we should be thinking about. Yes, sanctions are designed, hopefully, to impose a cost on the regime, but there are reports about issues pertaining to the shortage of medicine and medical equipment and goods in Iran. So the average Iranian is also paying the price for the regime's malign activities and policies, and that's something else that we should also be thinking about.
Thank you.
Well, you know what I think about this. I do agree with you. I think restrictions on cultural visits and on educational visits by Iranian students and others is self-defeating. I do hope that in supporting things like this that we are mindful that the Iranian government doesn't control who gets to come here and who doesn't get to come here. What we want is an opportunity for the young people that we all keep talking about to actually have a chance to see what a democratic country looks like and see what a better life looks like and take that back home with them when they go. So I couldn't agree with you more. I do think that this administration has done more than is appreciated on the question of supporting internal communications inside Iran. I think they've done more than I know we have done previously in either Republican or Democratic administrations to stand by people who've been imprisoned by the Iranian regime, have done more to try to help get them out of prison. On the other hand, there's much more that can be done. There are no sanctions on food and medicine, as you know. We shouldn't allow them to exploit this. What I would love for us to do is what we did during the Soviet era, which is to elevate this as a matter that we discuss in every single meeting. I've said it before at this committee, when we talk about the human rights and human freedom of the Iranian people and about the predations of their government.
Thank you.
Mr. Chabot?
Thank you very much, Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Carlin, I'll begin with you if I can. How would you expect the IRGC's regional operations to change without Soleimani at the helm?
Thank you for that. Thank you for that question, Mr. Congressman. Qasem Soleimani was important, but he was not irreplaceable. The IRGC has been a tremendously effective organization, unfortunately, over decades, and also despite financial pressures over the years as well. So I suspect there will be an effort to facilitate and deepen relationships with various groups. In particular, we saw Qasem Soleimani really oversaw this magnificent kind of knitting together of various clients in places like Syria. So his replacement will have to work on facilitating new and deeper relationships as well. That said, I do not expect any meaningful change whatsoever. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Tabatabai, I hope I pronounced that right. I'll go to you next. How do you expect Iran's relationship with the PMF, the so-called Popular Mobilization Forces, to change without Mohandas in the picture?
Yes, thank you. A similar answer. I think that the relationship is very strategic right now. As both the United States and Iran start to enter a new era of competition in Iraq, the PMF is going to be a critical asset for Iran. We've seen how closely Kataib Hezbollah has been following the Iranian lead over the past year especially, and I suspect that that will continue to happen, and Kataib Hezbollah specifically will continue to remain a tool by which Iran exercises pressure on the United States.
Thank you very much. Ms. Plecht, I'll go to you next. First of all, I used to periodically, about once a year for a number of years, go and teach, lecture to students at the University of Dayton, just north of my district, which is Cincinnati. And the professor there was a Father Pletka, and I was just curious if you know if there's any relationship.
Nope.
He was
Absolutely none.
great-
The word father is the dead giveaway for me, since that's not my religion.
Okay. Well, he was a great priest and a great guy, but in any event. With the Soleimani strike, President Trump made clear that killing Americans was a very red line. Nevertheless, over the weekend, we saw Iranian proxies hit our embassy in Baghdad with rockets. I think we assume that Iran was involved with this. What, if any, adjustments would you recommend to the administration relative to deterrence and Iran?
Well, after the Soleimani strike, people said that the United States had restored deterrence in the region. I think that what's missing here is a sense of clarity about what those red lines actually are. And what had happened in the run-up to this was that the Iranians had been testing us over the last year or two, right? Like your little brother, am I bugging you now? Am I bugging you now? With successive escalations in strikes. And they finally went too far. That's not a really great way to run a relationship. It's better to have that clarity up front. And so what we're looking at now, in the aftermath of the strike, is the Iranians once again trying to figure out what it is they can do. Iranian proxies are now involved in this. The attacks on the Green Zone and on our facility in Baghdad are most likely coming from Iranian proxies. We should make no mistake, their ultimate instructions come from Tehran, but at the same time, it's Iraqi forces that are doing this. And I think that they don't know exactly what we're going to do in response. I would very much welcome the idea of the president standing up and being very clear about what it is that the United States is willing to tolerate and what it is not willing to tolerate, and that he would not fall into the trap of saying, and if you keep at this, we're going to withdraw troops, because of course that is the aim of the attacks in the first place.
Thank you very much. And with the little bit of time I have left, I'll follow up if I can with another question. In the past few months, we've seen popular frustration with Iran's influence and its proxies in Lebanon. How should we respond to these protests and the demands of the protesters? How can we be sympathetic and helpful without having it turned against us?
It's a good question because obviously you don't want people labeled as puppets, but that is part of the risk that comes with the game. If we remember during the Cold War, all of the Soviet refuseniks and dissidents were labeled as American puppets because that's what dictatorships do to their opponents. Inside Lebanon, I think we have done a lamentable job in trying to fight against the corruption that has frankly not just ripped off money from the Lebanese people, but ripped off money from the World Bank, ripped off money from USAID and the American taxpayer. This is a systemic corruption that has taken place in the government of Lebanon that is, and make no mistake, this is not just Hezbollah involved in systemic corruption. That's why people are out in the streets. It's not for some political reason. It's because they're sick and tired of not having. Do you realize that in Beirut, which is considered by some to be the Paris or the Switzerland of the Middle East, they don't have electricity 24 hours a day in some parts? That is because this government has been incapable of not lining its own pockets and doing the right thing in providing services. The United States isn't very good in helping fight against corruption. That goes for Iraq, that goes for Lebanon, and frankly, it goes for a lot of other places. We could really step it up in that area.
Thank you. My time's expired, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Conley?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm sorry our friend from Pennsylvania is still not here. To deny that the killing of Soleimani was not an assassination really brings, George Orwell to tears. What was it? A mercy killing? Euthanasia by drone? It was an assassination. It was the targeting and killing of a foreign leader. Now, we can debate whether that's appropriate or warranted, but it is what it is. And unfortunately, it's that kind of Orwellian behavior that characterizes all too much of what passes for a foreign policy in the Middle East. We heard that it was, quote, incoherent to denounce the Soleimani strike and the abandonment of the Kurds in the same breath, but both have the same thing in character, and I'd ask you, Dr. Carlin, to comment. No consultation with Congress, no coordination with allies, absence of any kind of larger context for strategy, damaging counter-ISIS operations, and increasing threats to Americans. So both actions, though different in nature, had similar characteristics and consequences. Your comment, Dr. Carlin.
Thank you for that question, Mr. Congressman. I couldn't agree with you more. Look, we can all agree that Qasem Soleimani was a horrific human being who was detrimental to U.S. national security interests, period, full stop. There's no debate about that. Responsible for the deaths and at least the maiming of thousands of American servicemen and women. That said, it is still not clear why he was killed, when he was killed, and where he was killed. That is profoundly worrisome. So I think it makes sense to question why did that happen? What were we expecting? What do we expect to happen after that? And also to note, as you do, sir, the confusion surrounding our relationship with the Kurds and our partners around the region. Any successes we have in this region are due to our partners in the region and also outside of the region, like the counter-ISIS coalition members, like our allies in Europe. When they're not sure what we're trying to do, then we can't all work in lockstep in support of a coherent and sustainable policy.
Would you say that the unilateral renouncement of our own agreement, JCPOA, that was working in all respects, might fit in that category?
I think it was profoundly unhelpful. I would have rather that we had worked with our close allies to try to get a pathway to another agreement.
Would you say that by abandoning JCPOA, nonetheless, it achieved the objectives of curbing bad Iranian behavior in the region?
I don't think we see much evidence of that, and
Right.
we see the U.S. standing alone.
Do you think sanctions have curbed their behavior in the region, in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon?
I think sanctions have been unhelpful to them domestically, but at the end of the day, as we saw during the Iran-Iraq war, they'll find a way to fund what they need to fund.
Yeah. Dr.
Thank you.
Tabatabai, have we seen evidence of the curbing of bad Iranian behavior, from our point of view, bad, in the region, based on either sanctions or the withdrawal of the United States from JCPOA?
Not strategically, no. There may have been some tactical changes here and there. For example, they may have less money to send to various groups, but in terms of their activities in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, et cetera, we continue to see a level of involvement and support from various groups.
I have a lot of respect for the ranking member, Mr. Wilson, who's also my friend. But when he talks about praising the president's peace with strength strategy, I would argue the opposite. There's plenty of evidence in front of us. There's no peace, and frankly, there's no strength. There's nothing but weakness and withdrawal of the United States from some strategic positioning in the region. I want to give you an opportunity, and you as well, Dr. Carlin, if you want to comment on it. You mentioned the possible collapse of the regime. We need to get ready for that. I know Dr. Pletka also referenced that and said, and I agree with her, it's probably unlikely, at least in the near term, but I want to give you an opportunity. Why should we think the regime could actually collapse, given its staying power since 1979?
Sir, I fully agree that it's the least likely scenario. However, I think that the United States should be prepared for all scenarios, and that is one possible.
So all right, forgive me for interrupting, but you weren't suggesting that's something that could be imminent or in the near future?
No, absolutely not.
Right.
I think it's the least likely scenario right now. I should also add that it's not clear what would happen next, even if the regime were to collapse.
Right.
There is a world in which there is a liberal democracy that replaces the Islamic Republic, but there's also the possibility that we will see something like Syria, a civil war, or even a similar regime with different ideology replace the current one.
Yeah. This is a monumental subject, and of course, there's not a single person at the press table on the subject of Iran. Which is amazing, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Ranking Member, but thank you both for holding this hearing, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you. Mr. Watkins?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think General Soleimani was a righteous and justified kill. He, when looking for why, how about the 600 some odd soldiers that he killed, our brothers and our sisters? And also, the strategy is credible deterrent. It's a far cry from the appeasement strategy that was proven to not work. It's a maximum pressure campaign, and having spent years at the tactical level, I assure you that when you go out on missions, the idea is that should anything happen to you, you want the enemy combatants knowing that hellfire will rain down upon them should anything happen to you. And that is a credible deterrent, and I assure you that is far more effective than the hope that your commander-in-chief giving them money will somehow make them not want to kill you. That's ridiculous. It never works, and it never will. The credible deterrent, the maximum pressure campaign, is far more effective, particularly in this part of the globe. So when I hear our guests ask, well, why kill him? Because he was a combatant, as evident by the title that he preferred going by, which was general, right? So he was a high-ranking enemy combatant, probably overseeing the violent attacks on the embassy, which he probably helped to orchestrate. So that's your why. And the mere fact that he got paid in part by a government paycheck from Iran, which was the leading state sponsor of terror, is a moot point. He was an enemy combatant in Iraq outside of his country, and so I relish in the fact that he doesn't live to kill any more Americans. Which people, when you keep asking, what happens next? How about the fact that they try and continue to kill us? That's what happens next. And the mere fact now that they've got one less operative, a very powerful and influential one at that, makes our jobs safer and easier. Ms. Pletka, what do you think the administration's strike on Soleimani will deter? Do you think that the administration's strike on Soleimani will deter Iran's future operations in any way?
Sir, I think it has the capacity to do that. I don't think you're seeing anybody lament the parting of Qasem Soleimani, although there are political disagreements about whether it was wise or not. I certainly don't, and believe the president was justified in this choice. The question really for us is follow-up, and what we need from the administration is clarity. Because if you look at the run-up in last year, you saw a number of attacks by Iran or by Iranian proxies on both American assets, the drone, but also on global oil supplies. The United States has, through the last decades, no matter the president, had a doctrine of opposition to interference in the continuity of global energy supplies. The perceived failure of the president to respond to the attacks on Abqaiq and on Khurais in Saudi Arabia gave Iran the idea that he was not going to stand up to them. Soleimani turned that around, but we don't know what's next. And I do think it's really important for the administration to clarify and to capitalize on the deterrence that was restored with that strike to tell the Iranians what it is we will and we will not tolerate. Because otherwise, as you've seen over the last week, they will either directly, although much more likely through proxies, continue to test and see. And when they test us, we are likely to see Americans injured. But frankly, while Americans are my top priority, I don't want the Iranians killing anybody. They ought to stop.
Understood, but you can see the escalation going from a drone to oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz to oil field attack in Saudi Arabia to the killing of Americans. You'd agree that there is some model of escalation there. It represents as one, right? And so what would your recommendation then be?
Well, as I said, I think that, again, I think that the Soleimani strike has managed to let's say, halt momentarily that direct escalation. In other words, Iran using Iranian territory and Iranian forces to actually attack. What it hasn't done, unfortunately, is made clear to the Iranians that they cannot use their proxies to do the same thing. And that's where I think we need to be wary. Look, yesterday, the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad was hit by several missiles. That's not a lesson learned. And they need to learn that lesson. Otherwise, somebody else is going to get killed.
Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Thank you. Mr. Keating?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Several years ago, I dined with some of our troops in Iraq, our soldiers, and just hours after we had dinner, several of them were killed with a rocket attack. It was an Iranian-powered rocket, almost certainly the handiwork of Soleimani. We don't mourn his death one iota. But I think for the purpose of this hearing, we've got to expand the way we're looking at the issue, or we'll just be lost. And here's what I want to, and particularly in response to Dr. Carlin's opening remarks, that the administration needs to create a clear strategy and rebuild diplomatic relations with Iraq and move towards nuclear. We have right now the administration saying they're going to continue maximum pressure strategy. And to date, even administration members saying to date that's not been successful. Yet we're also saying, well, we have to engage them in discussions for a new nuclear agreement since we pulled out of the JCPOA. Well, it's contradictory. I mean, how do you accomplish that? You can't use a carrot and a stick at the same time. There's no clarity with that, the clarity you spoke to, Dr. Carlin. So where do we go forward in the big picture here? We have a strategy to date that's not working. Meanwhile, Iran is moving forward, and it's my belief, based upon what I can just estimate, I'll leave it at that, that they're closer to a year, thanks to the JCPOA, than 6 months to a breakout. But the clock is ticking. So what we have, maximum pressure, not working to date. Discussions about why we should have discussions and about a nuclear agreement. The clock is ticking, and pretty soon, every day, they're closer to being a nuclear power. And the problem we have dealing with them is just going to be that much more difficult. Just look at North Korea. So where do we go? Where's this clarity, and how can you possibly move forward without making a decision? Now, who are the intermediaries? I mean, the Sultan of Oman passed away, and he was an intermediary in the past. can you suggest, Dr. Collins, you know, you're saying Congress should have a greater role, but with the administration, with this contradictory carrot and stick approach and no clarity whatsoever, how do we go forward?
Thank you for that question, Mr. Congressman. We do need to acknowledge that it just hasn't been working, that increasingly the United States is standing alone, and that problematically the conversation is increasingly about the United States rather than about the Iranians. That's distracting and profoundly unhelpful. So where we go is by starting to find some other allies. It's always better when more folks are on your team than not. So I think—
Yes, but our historic allies are in agreement with the JCPOA. They didn't pull out.
Indeed.
So that creates an enormous difficulty with them being intermediaries. They would be arguing against themselves.
Indeed, and I think we probably need to make some sort of shift, acknowledging that any discussion toward a new nuclear agreement will be highly imperfect, but it's a story where something is better than nothing. So working with the Germans, the Brits, the French in particular will be crucial. I should emphasize that the administration hasn't done much to build a pathway to a new agreement, and moreover, the Russians appear to be the ones all over the Middle East. So
And by the way, if I could, that's not getting us any closer because if we continue with maximum pressure, Iran's not going to negotiate with continued maximum pressure. We'll put them in a spot where their option seems to be, let's go ahead with the nuclear plant, let's let our proxies act, and we don't have contingencies in place to deal with that. And you know, we have the sanctions, but the Revolutionary Guard, they're getting money from the black market when there's sanctions even. So, I think you addressed they managed to get their money somehow. Well, that's one of the ways they do it. So these contradictions are there. Don't you think the administration has to come to grips with selecting one avenue and pursuing it and not have these series of contradictions?
Well, maximum pressure increasingly sounds like regime change, and it sounds like a test they just can't pass. So why try to even study for it? So effectively, I do think one can have a policy that mixes carrots and sticks as long as it's nuanced and thoughtful. But if the Iranians feel like there's absolutely nothing they can do to meaningfully get the U.S. to shift, I don't see why they would do so.
That is the problem, and we'll work as a Congress and a committee to try and delve into those issues. Thank you for being here. But until we acknowledge the big picture here, we're going to continue to put ourselves perilously close to conflict and war. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Mast?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Have any of you all been in a fight, physical or combat or otherwise? Have you been in a fight? Have any of you been in a fist fight or in combat? That's not rhetorical. I'm asking you.
I can't speak for my colleagues, but I've certainly been in a fight. Why do you ask?
Have you been in a fight?
In a fist fight?
Or combat,
Sure. Not in combat.
but a fist fight?
Not that I recall.
Okay. So it's hypothetical for you, doctor. If somebody's fighting you and you hit them back, is that escalation or defense? I'll take your silence as exactly. We weren't escalating. We were defending ourselves against a terrorist who's gone out there and hit us time and time and time again. Let me ask you something maybe y'all can't answer. When was the last time that Soleimani hit us before he ended up in about 5 separate pieces on the side of a tarmac?
I don't know, Mr. Congressman, that anyone is debating how awful he was or how many servicemen and women whose deaths or maimings he's responsible.
People are, but that's not my question. When was the last time he hit us?
He's consistently hitting us.
No, when was the last time he hit us? When was the very last time that Soleimani hit us?
consistently up until his death.
Okay, so right up until his death, he was hitting us. You agree with that? His last actions right before his death was hitting the United States of America.
I think there's no debate that up until the end of his life, Qasem Soleimani was working against U.S. national security interests.
But what about his last actions? Literally, I mean, you guys are Director of Strategic Studies, political scientists, foreign and defense policy studies. You guys study this. What was his last act of terrorism before we ended his life on the side of a tarmac?
None of us have security clearances. I think what we are all aware of is that he was coordinating the attacks on the American embassy.
It's open source information. You don't need a security clearance to know that.
What I'm aware of is that he was coordinating attacks on the American embassy with the leadership of the Popular Mobilization Forces, the Hashd-e-Shaabi. That's what I know. I don't know whether my colleagues have better
So
knowledge.
right up until his last moment, he was hitting us. He was attacking us. And you all are coming in here saying there's some kind of escalation that's going on. You don't think if somebody was hitting us right up until the last second, that's defense? This academic approach to defense I find absolutely worthless. Let's go to some other questions here. What was the imminent threat that was posed by Osama bin Laden when we executed him? What was the imminent threat that was posed by him while he was hiding out in his compound in Pakistan? Was there an imminent threat? Was there any intel about he was planning something immediately? More crickets? Was he executed within borders that the U.S. had an authorized use of military force to go into?
If I may, I don't recall that the Obama administration argued that Osama bin Laden was being killed due to an imminent threat. So it's really just a question of justification. And I think where we're a little confused is the Trump administration has given us about 17 different reasons why Qasem Soleimani has been killed. Any and all of them may be accurate. I'm just not sure which.
Who posed a greater threat at the time of their death, bin Laden or Soleimani? More crickets. I think it's because y'all don't want to answer these questions. So I'm
No,
going
it's not.
to
It's not
end with
because
this
we don't wanna
statement
answer
right here,
these
right
questions.
now.
It's-
I think I find this whole conversation is just an exercise in you folks being trapped in a Cold War policy purgatory where you're not recognizing that we've moved out of this ladder of escalation, as you all are talking about. Oh, you need to have this designated, exactly, they know what we're going to do. If we see them do this, that's not the way that it works. It's okay to have selective ambiguity. It's okay that they be surprised by the actions, and it's good for foreign policy for them to not know exactly the way the president's going to hit them. That's strength. And in that, I appreciate the fact that you all took the time to come here, although I found its worth to be minimal.
Thank you. Mr. Vargas.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank the ranking member and the witnesses here today. I do want to ask a few more questions, if I could, with respect to the maximum pressure campaign. I think it was stated here today that was helpful domestically or unhelpful domestically, in the sense it was putting pressure domestically, not on other operations internationally in the region. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Whomever would like to. Yeah, Doctor, go ahead.
Sure. Yes. Thank you, sir. So I think in terms of creating grievances, deepening grievances that exist in Iran, it's certainly done that. People are upset with how things are going. A lot of the economic grievances are, of course, tied to the regime's own incompetence, mismanagement, but the sanctions are certainly having an impact. I think the key question that we should be asking ourselves, though, because hopefully we're not in the business of hurting countries for the sake of hurting countries, but in order to achieve our objectives, is what are the objectives we're trying to achieve, and is maximum pressure helping us get to that point? I certainly think that in terms of a strategic impact, we haven't seen that yet.
Would you agree with that, Ms. Plitka?
I think we have seen a strategic impact. What we are not going to see is, from one strike, the Iranians changing what is essentially the gravamen of their foreign policy. Iranian foreign policy has, for the last at least 3 decades, if not really since the inception of the Islamic Republic, been structured around indirect conflict rather than direct, except for the Iran-Iraq war. So
but
the
not so
notion
much
that they
the-
would toss that by the wayside after the death of Qasem Soleimani is unlikely.
But no, I think you may have
sorry.
misunderstood or misheard my question.
I
It
apologize.
wasn't the strike at all.
Oh,
No,
didn't-
my question was on the issue of maximum pressure campaign. So the maximum pressure campaign, it does seem to have done something internally in the country, and that you do see more protest. You do see that there is some disruption, certainly by some. I mean, that I think is
My apologies.
That's okay.
Still the same-
I
still the
know
same-
you were so focused, but go ahead and try to
Still the
answer my
same answer. Still the same answer,
Yeah.
which is that I think we've seen some impact in terms of Iran's ability to continue to fund its proxies. When Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, goes out and starts begging for money, that's probably good news for people who hate terrorism, and that's certainly had an impact. We've seen that they've not been able to support. They've not been able to meet payroll in certain instances. There's no question that when the Islamic Republic is forced to choose to spend money on these proxy forces and doesn't, that's a good thing for us. Does that mean that they're going to abandon the entire raison d'être of their foreign policy, which is the use and building up of these proxies? No, it doesn't. But it's made it much harder, and it has, I think there is persuasive evidence that it has made an issue of it internally, because people do resent the notion that they're paying other guys to fight in Syria, which is not, I think, in the view of most Iranians, critical to their interests, that they're paying other people to fight for Assad when they're not spending at home.
Dr. Carlin, what do you think?
I think it has had an effect. However, when I look at the 2 buckets of concern I have with Iranian policy, there's the nuclear file and there's the bad behavior regionally file. Effectively, the Iranians are doing pretty well on both of those. So at the strategic level, I don't think we have seen the change that we need to. Thank you.
Yeah, the concern I've always had, of course, is the nuclear side. And I personally didn't think that the deal that we had with them was a great deal. I was one of the first people to come out against it on the Democratic side. However, there was, I think, some good that was for the first 15 years. It was the second 15 years and beyond, I think, was a disaster. But there's nothing in place now at all, which I think is even worse, obviously. But we have to do something. And lastly, I guess I would just throw this out. I certainly would always think of Iran and Iraq as counterbalances when Saddam Hussein was there. You even see the Iran-Iraq war in 1980, I think, to 88, where it was sort of a stalemate and huge losses on both sides, but certainly, in my own opinion, 2 very rough, difficult, maybe tyrannical groups fighting against each other there, the politicians and the armies. But there is no counterbalance yet that's proximate to that country. In fact, just the opposite now. It seems that Iraq is cozying up to it, and that's a real problem. Any quick comments? I know my time's about out.
Yeah, I certainly would agree that since 2003, Iran has had less of a challenge from Iraq, and in fact, it has been able to expand its influence in Iraq, largely thanks to us toppling Saddam.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
But
Chairman.
we
I
don't
went
miss
over.
Saddam Hussein, we should underscore.
Excuse
We
me?
don't miss Saddam Hussein.
Don't miss Saddam Hussein?
No.
I don't miss him at all.
No,
I
and
miss him
neither
with the
do
bad
we.
guys.
We should underscore that.
I just remember strategically there was a counterbalance, but I don't miss any of those guys.
Thank you, Mr. Vargas. I will recognize myself for 5 minutes. Welcome to the witnesses. I'm sorry that I was delayed. Later today, Ranking Member Wilson and I will join our colleagues on the House floor to consider HRES 752 resolution supporting the rights of the Iranian people to free expression and condemning the regime for its crackdown on legitimate protests, the violent crackdown on expression, shutting down of the internet. I want to also take a moment to thank my friend, Mr. Malinowski, for his powerful comments about the abhorrent U.S. policy towards Iranians who want to come to this country. And I'd like to just ask a question or two about that. Dr. Tabatabai, the United States recently barred Iranians from accessing E1 and E2 non-immigrant visas that allow foreign nationals to enter the United States to engage in international trade or to invest capital. Of course, the administration barred all immigrant visas to Iranians in early 2017. How do we make sense of what we're going to be doing on the House floor later, standing with the Iranian people, and the bans that are in place? Can you just, they're, as Mr. Malinowski points out, they're so utterly inconsistent, but I would love your insight.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think those two things are somewhat contradictory, to say the least. On the one hand, we are saying that we stand with the Iranian people in their fight against their own tyrannical regime. On the other hand, we're barring them from entering the country. I would agree on very thin grounds when it comes to national security concerns. And in fact, I think that allowing these students who have gone through the process, who have been deemed as not posing a challenge, a threat to U.S. national security, allowing them to come to this country to study in top universities, as many of them have been accepted, is good for our image. It allows them to be exposed to different ways of thinking, to experience democracy firsthand, and ultimately it allows them to contribute to our economy as well. So I think that it is a positive thing to allow them to come here, and I think that it is very important, if we're saying that we're standing with the Iranian people, that we're also putting our money where our mouth is.
Thanks. Ms. Pleka, isn't there isn't there a benefit at the same time that we're expressing our support for the Iranian people and their desire for democracy to allow them to be exposed to democracy here?
Congressman Malinowski raised this with all three of us before you were able to be here, and I said exactly what I'm about to say again, which is it's completely inconsistent. While we need to be mindful about both national security questions, because Iranians have tried to conduct terrorism on our soil and have tried to and have looked to supply their nuclear and missile program with purchasers here in the United States. At the same time, if we are mindful, if we're not good enough to keep those guys out and let the right people in, then shame on us.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you. In my remaining time, I just want to spend a moment talking about what all of this means to our efforts to try to free Americans and other foreign nationals that the Iranians hold hostage. And that includes my constituent, Bob Levinson, who was abducted nearly 13 years ago. The tensions that exist now obviously affect negotiations over American citizens who have been wrongly detained or held hostage. I would open this to any of you. A diplomatic channel to discuss hostages, a potential off-ramp, an opportunity to de-escalate tensions is critical. Is it your sense, any of you, that exists? How much harder is it now? Ms. Pleka, we'll start with you and go down there.
There is a diplomatic channel to discuss hostages, and it resulted in the release of a Princeton student who was being illegally held inside Iran. It resulted in the first information we've had, actually, about Bob Levinson in some time. It is one of the contradictions of this administration, perhaps, that it has been, I think, unusually successful and unusually diligent in trying to, in paying attention to both Americans and others imprisoned in regimes like Iran's. So actually, that's a hopeful sign.
Dr. Tabatabai.
Yeah, if I may, just one more point to add to this, which is that we also have allies, the UK, Australia, and other countries, France, who have dual nationals and their own nationals who are held in Iran. So this is one more avenue where we should be working with our allies because they share our interests there.
Dr. Carlin?
I have nothing to add, sir.
Yeah. I think your assessment is exactly right. I would simply make the request of you, as I make everyone who appears here, that every every amount of credit that we give to the administration and others that the administration works with on being diligent and focusing on this issue. As we focus on those efforts, let's also acknowledge the fact that none of those efforts will be deemed fully successful until everyone has the opportunity to return home, including my constituent Bob Levinson. And it's a point I've made to the administration and continue to, just as I have to the prior administration and everyone who's been involved in this. I thank you very much for being here. And again, I apologize for my delay. Mr. Wilson?
Yes, thank you, Chairman Deutsch. And as we conclude, certainly in a bipartisan manner, we can recognize that Nawrez Hamid, an Iraqi-American, was killed by an Iranian rocket on December 27th. It was 5 days later that Soleimani was killed. And so the context needs to be placed, and not to forget Nawrez Hamid, who was buried in California, was an appreciated Iraqi-American Muslim. Thank you.
Well, again, thanks very much to the witnesses. Appreciate your being here. We thank you for your testimony. Members of the subcommittee, as you all know, may have some additional questions, and we ask you to please respond to those questions in writing. And I would ask my colleagues that any questions for the hearing be submitted to the subcommittee clerk within 5 business days. And with that, this meeting is adjourned.